Berlin, Kammhuber Line Headquarters, February 24, 1944, 0300 hours, and Generalmajor Josef Schmid stared at the operations board displaying the impossible 17 Nachtjagdgeschwader aircraft missing in a single night, their last transmissions cutting off mid-sentence, their plots vanishing from the radar screens as if something had reached through the darkness and plucked them from existence. The telephone from Luftflotte Reich operations rang with news that made his blood freeze. Hauptmann Heinrich Prinz zu Sayn-Wittgenstein, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, 83 victories, Germany's third-ranking night fighter ace, had been shot down over the Netherlands by what survivors described as a ghost mosquito that appeared from nowhere, fired with lethal precision, then vanished before anyone could react. What Schmid didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for the past 8 months their greatest technological advantage had become their death warrant, that every pulse of their Liechtenstein radar, every sweep of their FUG 220 arrays, was broadcasting their position to specially equipped Royal Air Force Mosquitoes carrying a device so simple yet so devastating that when Hermann Göring finally understood its implications, he reportedly threw a crystal decanter against the wall of his Hall estate and screamed that the British had made fools of the entire Luftwaffe. The story began with German confidence so absolute that Oberstleutnant Werner Streib, commanding Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, had told his pilots in September 1943 that their Liechtenstein-equipped Messerschmitt Bf-110 and Junkers Ju-88 night fighters were invisible killers, untouchable in the darkness, guided by radar that could detect British bombers at 6 kilometers while remaining completely undetected themselves. The irony of that statement would haunt the survivors for decades. They were indeed transmitting signals that could be detected, signals that British scientists had been studying since a Junkers Ju-88 R-1 night fighter landed in Scotland on May 9, 1943, delivered by defecting Luftwaffe crew members who brought with them not just an aircraft but the complete technical specifications of the FUG 202 Liechtenstein BC radar system. In the winter darkness of early 1943, the German night fighter force had reached the pinnacle of its effectiveness. A killing machine that turned the night skies over the Reich into a graveyard for Royal Air Force Bomber Command. Major Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who would eventually claim 121 victories, described those months as shooting fish in a barrel, the British four-engine bombers appearing on their Liechtenstein screens as bright phosphorescent dots. Unable to hide, unable to run, unable to do anything but die. The statistics from January through March 1943 tell a story of technological superiority that seemed insurmountable. Bomber Command lost 584 aircraft, German night fighters claimed over 600 kills, and the loss rate for British raids climbed to 7%, approaching the unsustainable threshold that would force them to abandon the offensive entirely. The Liechtenstein radar, manufactured by Telefunken with the designation FUG 202, operated on frequencies between 485 and 505 MHz, its 32 dipole matrix antenna array protruding from the night fighters' noses like mechanical antlers, ugly but devastatingly effective. Feldwebel Wilhelm Jonen, radar operator with Nachtjagdgeschwader 5, recalled the almost godlike feeling of watching British bombers appear on his screens while knowing they had absolutely no idea death was approaching. We could see them from 6 kilometers, track them, position ourselves perfectly, and they never knew we were there until our cannons opened fire. The system General Joseph Kammhuber had created was a masterpiece of integrated air defense, a series of radar-controlled boxes stretching from Denmark to Switzerland, each Himmelbett cell containing a Würzburg radar for tracking, searchlights for illumination, and a dedicated night fighter guided by ground control to within visual range of its target. By spring 1943, the Kammhuber Line employed over 2,000 night fighters, 15,000 radar operators and technicians, and consumed nearly 20% of the entire Luftwaffe budget. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, visiting a night fighter base in April 1943, watched a demonstration where a captured British bomber was tracked and theoretically destroyed 5 times in succession by different night fighters, each guided unerringly by Liechtenstein radar, prompting him to declare that the British terror bombers will be swept from our skies like autumn leaves. Hamburg, July 24, 1943, 2300 hours, and Oberleutnant Hans Joachim Jabs of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 stared at his Liechtenstein display in complete bewilderment as thousands of reflections suddenly filled the screen, a blizzard of false echoes that made it impossible to distinguish real bombers from whatever the British were dropping. His radar operator, Unteroffizier Kurt Bundrock, frantically adjusted the gain and frequency, but nothing helped. The screen remained a chaos of returns, as if the entire sky had suddenly filled with aircraft. What they were witnessing was the first operational use of window, strips of aluminum foil cut to half the wavelength of German radar, creating false echoes that blinded the elaborate defensive system Germany had spent 3 years perfecting. The Hamburg raids of late July 1943, what the British called Operation Gamara and the Germans simply called the catastrophe, demonstrated with horrifying clarity that radar superiority could evaporate in an instant. 739 British bombers attacked on July 27, creating a firestorm that killed 42,000 civilians, and the night fighters managed only 12 confirmed kills. Their Liechtenstein radars useless, their ground control confused, their entire system reduced to desperate visual searching in a sky filled with smoke and flames. Major Hajo Hermann, witnessing the chaos, implemented his wild sow tactics, single-engine day fighters operating over the burning cities using the light of the fires below. But it was a desperate measure that acknowledged the fundamental reality. Germany's technological advantage had been neutralized. The response from German scientists and engineers was immediate and impressive, demonstrating the technical prowess that had made Germany a leader in electronics before the war. Within weeks, Telefunken engineers had modified the Liechtenstein sets to operate on different frequencies, and by October 1943 the new FUG 220 Liechtenstein SN2 was entering service, operating at 90 MHz in the VHF band, immune to the existing window countermeasures. The new radar used 8 larger dipole elements arranged in what crews called Hirschgeweih, stag's antlers, producing so much drag that night fighters lost 50 km per hour of speed. But it worked, cutting through the aluminum chaff to find British bombers again. What the celebrating German crews didn't know was that British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had been preparing for this moment since May 9, 1943, when Oberleutnant Herbert Schmid landed his Junkers Ju-88R1 at our AF Dice in Scotland, defecting with a complete FUG 202 Liechtenstein BC set. The examination of this equipment revealed something remarkable. The German radar operated on frequencies that could be detected and tracked by modified British equipment. Within weeks of Schmid's defection, a brilliant adaptation was developed. The AI Mark IV radar sets in our AF night fighters, which operated on similar frequencies, could have their transmitters disconnected and be converted into passive receivers that would home in on German radar emissions. The device was christened Serrate, and its elegant simplicity was matched only by its devastating effectiveness. Squadron leader Brance Burbridge, who would become the RAF's second highest scoring night fighter ace with 21 victories, described his first Serrate interception in December 1943. "We flew parallel to the bomber stream, about 50 kilometers off to the side, and my radar operator called out, 'Serrate contact, 20 degrees starboard, range estimate far.' We turned toward it, and the signal grew stronger, leading us directly to a Bf-110 that was stalking the bombers. He never saw us coming. We were behind and below in his blind spot, guided by his own radar emissions. One burst from our cannons, and he went down burning." Number 141 Squadron RAF began Serrate operations on December 16, 1943, during the Battle of Berlin, when squadron leader F.F. Lambert and flying officer K. Deer damaged a Messerschmitt Bf-110 near Brandenburg, the first confirmed success of what would become a sustained campaign to turn German radar from an asset into a liability. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German crews who had operated with impunity in darkness suddenly found themselves being hunted, attacked from unexpected angles by enemies they couldn't see or detect, their own radar emissions serving as homing beacons for death. By February 1944, what German night fighter crews called Mosquito panic had spread through the entire force, a pervasive fear that any radar transmission might attract a British intruder, that every shadow might hide a mosquito guided by their own emissions. Feldwebel Peter Spaden of Nachtjagdgeschwader 6 described the paranoia that gripped crews. "We would turn on our Liechtenstein for just seconds at a time, quick pulses to check for bombers, then immediately shut it down and change position. Some pilots refused to use radar at all, preferring to hunt blind rather than risk becoming prey." The statistics from the first quarter of 1944 reveal the devastating effectiveness of the Serrate campaign. German night fighter losses increased by 300%, from an average of 22 per month in late 1943 to 66 per month by March 1944, while their success rate against British bombers plummeted from 1 kill per 11 sorties to 1 per 28 sorties. The elaborate ground control system that had been the backbone of German night defense began to fracture as controllers could no longer rely on their fighters to follow directions, knowing that extended radar use might result in a Mosquito attack. The German response was chaotic and increasingly desperate, a series of technological band-aids that revealed growing panic within the Luftwaffe High Command. The FUG 227 Flensburg was introduced, designed to home in on the tail-warning Monica radar carried by British bombers, allowing German fighters to become hunters again. For a brief period in spring 1944, it worked brilliantly. German crews could detect British bombers from their Monica emissions at ranges up to 130 kilometers, approaching from behind where the defensive guns were weakest. Hauptmann Martin Drews of Nachtjagdgeschwader 1 claimed 3 Lancaster bombers in a single night using Flensburg, describing it as like having a magic arrow pointing directly at the target. Then came July 13, 1944, a date that would live in infamy for the German night fighter force, when everything unraveled in the most absurd, most preventable way imaginable. Unteroffizier Hans Mackel of 7 Staffel, Nachtjagdgeschwader 2, flying a brand-new Junkers Ju-88G1 equipped with the latest FUG 220SN2 radar and FUG 227 Flensburg detector, became disoriented during a routine patrol from Delen airfield in the Netherlands. In darkness and low clouds, with his radio compass malfunctioning, Mackel made a navigational error that would compromise Germany's entire night fighter force. He flew on a reciprocal course, heading north instead of south, eventually running low on fuel over what he believed was Brandenburg but was actually Suffolk, England. At 04:25 hours, Mackel landed at our AF Woodbridge, an emergency airfield with an extra-long runway designed for damaged bombers, still believing he was somewhere near Berlin until British soldiers surrounded his aircraft with rifles raised. The intelligence windfall was beyond British expectations. Not only did they have a complete operational FUG 220SN2 set, but also the FUG 227 Flensburg system, complete with frequency settings, operational manuals, and 3 terrified crew members who, under interrogation, revealed every detail of German night fighter tactics, patrol patterns, and assembly beacons. Within 72 hours, Bomber Command had removed Monica radar from all its aircraft, eliminating the emissions that Flensburg detected, while the Telecommunications Research Establishment developed jammers for the SN2 frequencies. By August 1944, new versions of Serrate were being deployed that could home in on the SN2 emissions, and German night fighters found themselves blind and hunted once again. The psychological impact of the Woodbridge incident was devastating. Crews knew their most advanced equipment had been compromised but had no alternative systems available. Forced to continue using radar they knew was betraying them. The German disaster with radar detection was watched with horrified fascination by their Axis allies, particularly the Japanese, who were experiencing their own technological nightmare in the Pacific. Commander Yasuna Kazono of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 251st Air Group had developed the Nakajima J1N1S Gecko night fighter, installing upward-firing 20mm cannons to attack American B-29 superfortresses bombing Japan, but without effective radar, Japanese pilots were reduced to visual searching in vast night skies, achieving minimal success against the Silver bombers flying at 30,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Shigetoshi Kudo, technical officer with the Naval Aviation Technology Arsenal, studied German reports about Serrate with growing alarm, recognizing that Japan's rudimentary radar development made them even more vulnerable. The Japanese had developed the Type 3 Ku-6 Model 4 airborne radar, operating at 200 MHz with a range of only 3 kilometers, primitive compared to German systems and completely inadequate for night fighting. When Kudo learned about the Woodbridge incident and how easily German radar had been compromised, he wrote in his technical assessment, "If the Germans with their superior technology cannot protect their radar from enemy exploitation, what hope do we have?" The Japanese Navy's attempt to create an effective night fighter force ended in frustration and failure, their aircraft groping blindly in darkness while B-29s dropped incendiary bombs that destroyed entire cities. Warrant Officer Sachio Endo, flying a Gecko from Itsuji Airfield, managed to shoot down 8 B-29s through extraordinary skill and luck, but he was the exception. Most Japanese night fighter pilots never even saw their targets, their primitive radar systems providing neither the range nor resolution necessary for effective interception. The German reports about Mosquitoes using Serrate to hunt radar-equipped fighters convinced Japanese commanders to abandon radar development entirely, believing that any emissions would simply make their fighters easier targets. The Italian tragedy. In Italy, the situation was even more desperate, the Regia Aeronautica having entered the war with no night fighters, no airborne radar, and no realistic prospect of developing either. When General Giuseppe Fugger learned about German night fighter successes in 1942, he negotiated to purchase 12 Dornier Do 217J night fighters, believing this would give Italy the capability to defend against our AF night raids on Turin and Milan. The aircraft arrived in September 1942, but in a bureaucratic disaster that epitomized Italian military dysfunction, they came without radar sets, without radar operators, and without any documentation on how to install or operate the Liechtenstein systems. Maggiore Giovanni Garello, commanding the 235th Night Fighter Squadron at Lanate Pozzolo, described the frustration of having sophisticated twin-engine fighters that were essentially useless in their intended role. We had these beautiful aircraft with empty spaces in the nose where radar should be, our pilots flying on moonlit nights hoping to accidentally encounter British bombers, achieving nothing while our cities burned below us, when Italian technical officers finally traveled to Germany in March 1943 to learn about radar installation. They discovered that the FUG 202 sets they had been promised were now considered obsolete, compromised by British countermeasures, and no longer in production. The Italian armistice in September 1943 found the night fighter squadron with 6 operational Do 217 aircraft, still without radar, having claimed exactly 2 confirmed victories in 12 months of operations. Both achieved in daylight by accident when bombers were encountered returning from raids. The surviving aircraft were seized by the Germans and transferred to Luftwaffe units, where they were finally equipped with radar but by then were too few and too late to make any difference. The Italian experience demonstrated a fundamental truth about the radar war. Without the industrial base and technical expertise to develop and modify systems rapidly, nations were doomed to defeat in the electronic battlefield of night combat. By autumn 1944, the German night fighter force was trapped in a technological death spiral from which there was no escape. Every countermeasure produced a countermeasure, every new frequency was compromised within weeks, and the industrial base necessary to produce new equipment was being systematically destroyed by the same bombers the night fighters were supposed to stop. The introduction of the FUG 218 Neptune radar, operating on frequencies between 158 and 187 MHz, lasted exactly 6 weeks before British intelligence identified its characteristics and developed appropriate jammers. The FUG 228 Liechtenstein SN3, a higher-powered version designed to burn through jamming, never entered mass production because the Telefunken factory in Berlin was destroyed by bombing in November 1944. The human cost was catastrophic and accelerating. Nachtjagdgeschwader units that had operated for years with minimal losses suddenly found themselves losing entire Staffeln in single operations. On the night of March 24, 1945, during Bomber Command's assault on Wesel, 23 German night fighters were shot down by Mosquitoes using advanced Serrate Mark IV equipment that could discriminate between different German radar types and automatically track the strongest signal. Among the dead was Oberstleutnant Helmut Lent, one of Germany's greatest night fighter aces with 110 victories, shot down by a Mosquito that had tracked his radar emissions for 15 minutes before attacking from below, where the German fighter had no defensive armament. The psychological destruction paralleled the physical losses. Hauptmann Wilhelm Herget of Nachtjagdgeschwader 4, who survived the war with 73 victories, described the final months as flying in a nightmare where every tool we depended on had been turned against us. Crews would argue before missions about whether to use radar at all, some insisting it was suicide to activate any electronic equipment, others arguing it was impossible to find targets without it. The ground control system, once the pride of the German air defense network, degenerated into chaos as controllers gave contradictory orders. Fighters refused to follow vectors that required extended radar use, and increasing numbers of pilots simply turned off their radios and hunted alone, hoping luck would bring them to targets. The Mosquito Intruders of 100 Group had evolved their tactics to a deadly art form by early 1945. They would patrol known German night fighter assembly beacons, areas where fighters gathered before being vectored toward bomber streams, using Serrate to detect any radar emissions. When contact was made, they would approach from behind and below, areas where German night fighters had limited visibility and no defensive weapons, achieving surprise in 90% of engagements. Wing Commander Brants Burbridge, flying with 85 Squadron, described one patrol in February 1945 where he destroyed 3 German night fighters in 40 minutes, each one tracked by its radar emissions, each one destroyed before its crew knew they were under attack. It was almost too easy, like shooting sitting ducks. They were still operating as if their radar made them invisible, not understanding it was painting a target on their backs. In the Telefunken research laboratories in Berlin, desperate efforts were underway to develop radar systems that couldn't be exploited by enemy detection equipment. The FUG 240 Berlin represented Germany's attempt to match Allied centimetric radar technology, operating at wavelengths of 9 centimeters using a magnetron captured from a crashed British bomber in February 1943. The Berlin radar offered revolutionary capabilities: a narrow beam that was difficult to detect, range resolution measured in meters rather than hundreds of meters, and the ability to track targets in ground clutter that would blind longer wavelength systems. But the FUG 240 revealed the fundamental weakness of German electronics development in the war's final years: brilliant engineering crippled by industrial chaos. The magnetron required precision manufacturing techniques that German industry, under constant bombing and short of rare materials, couldn't maintain. Production began in October 1944 with a goal of 500 units per month. By war's end in May 1945, only 15 complete sets had been delivered, most never installed in aircraft because there were no trained technicians to maintain them and no pilots willing to trust experimental equipment when their lives were at stake. Dr. Wilhelm Runge, Telefunken's chief radar engineer, wrote in his post-war memoir about the frustration of watching German technological superiority evaporate. "We had solutions to every British countermeasure, designs that would have restored our advantage, but we needed 6 months to develop them, 3 months to test them, 6 months to produce them, and by then the British had moved 2 generations ahead. We were always fighting the last battle with equipment designed for the previous war." As Germany's night fighter force collapsed in early 1945, Japan faced an even more desperate situation, with B-29 superfortresses attacking Japanese cities with near impunity. The Japanese had studied German reports about Serrate and Mosquito intruders, leading to a radical decision: abandoned all radar development for night fighters, believing that any emissions would simply make their aircraft easier targets for American fighters. Instead, they developed tactics that seemed to come from another century. Pilots would fly above the B-29 formations, using the bombers' silhouettes against burning cities below, diving through the formation with guns blazing, hoping to damage something vital before the defensive guns found them. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu units operating from Narimesu Airfield near Tokyo developed the most extreme tactics: ramming attacks where pilots would deliberately collide with B-29s, sacrificing themselves to destroy bombers that were incinerating their homeland. Master Sergeant Yoshio Mida of the 53rd Sentai described the helplessness that drove men to such measures. "We knew about German radar, knew how the British had turned it against them, and we knew our own radar was so primitive it was worthless. So we flew by eye, by instinct, by desperation, achieving nothing while Tokyo burned beneath us." The technical intelligence reports from Germany had paradoxically made Japanese night fighting less effective, convincing commanders that electronic aids were more dangerous than useful, leading to the abandonment of projects that might have provided some defense against the strategic bombing campaign. The Type 4 Ku-6 Model 2 airborne radar, which had shown promise in trials, was cancelled in February 1945 specifically because of fears about American detection equipment similar to Serrate. Japanese pilots were reduced to using searchlights, ground fires, and moonlight medieval methods against the most advanced bombers in the world. The Italian Social Republic, Mussolini's rump state in northern Italy, made one last attempt to create a night fighter force in 1944, negotiating with Germany for surplus radar equipment from damaged aircraft. In November 1944, 3 Fiat G-55 fighters were modified with FUG 202 Liechtenstein sets removed from destroyed German night fighters, creating Italy's first and only radar-equipped interceptors. The installation was performed by German technicians at Guidi Airfield, with Italian pilots receiving exactly 3 hours of training on radar operation before being declared operational. Capitano Adriano Visconti, Italy's highest-scoring ace, flew one of these modified fighters on the night of April 12, 1945, attempting to intercept our AF bombers attacking Milan. His radar operator, Sergeant Giuseppe Rossi, had never successfully tracked a target in training, and on this night, with British jammers filling his screen with false returns and Mosquito intruders known to be operating in the area, Rossi simply turned off the radar after 5 minutes, telling Visconti better to be blind than to be a beacon. They returned to base without firing a shot, and 2 weeks later, Visconti was killed on the ground by Italian partisans, ending Italy's brief and futile experiment with radar-equipped night fighters. The death knell for German night fighting came with Operation Gisella on March 3, 1945, the Luftwaffe's last desperate attempt at a large-scale night operation. 142 night fighters were assembled to attack our AF bomber bases in England, hoping to destroy aircraft on the ground where electronic countermeasures couldn't protect them. The operation required fighters to fly at extreme range, navigate across the North Sea in darkness, find specific airfields, and return to bases in Germany or occupied Denmark, all while maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. The result was catastrophic farce. Without radar or radio navigation aids, most fighters became lost over England, wandering randomly while searching for airfields that looked nothing like their briefing maps. 27 fighters ran out of fuel and crashed into the sea. 12 were shot down by our AF night fighters guided by ground control. 8 crashed attempting to land at German bases in darkness, and 6 landed at our AF airfields by mistake, their crews surrendering to astonished British personnel. Of the aircraft that found targets, most attacked training bases or satellite fields with few aircraft present, achieving minimal damage while losing nearly 60% of the attacking force. Oberleutnant Fritz Kelb, one of the few pilots to survive Operation Gisella, described the mission as the moment we knew the war was truly over, flying a Junkers Ju-88 G6 with the latest radar equipment. Kelb had been ordered to keep all electronic systems off to avoid detection, essentially flying blind. We had the most sophisticated night fighter ever built, with radar that could track targets at 8 kilometers, navigation systems that could guide us anywhere, and we were ordered to fly it like a biplane from the First War, using compass and clock, praying we would accidentally find something to attack. The final statistics of the Serrate campaign reveal the completeness of the German defeat in the electronic warfare battlefield. From December 1943 to April 1945, our AF Mosquitoes using Serrate and associated detection equipment claimed 257 German night fighters destroyed, with another 79 probably destroyed and 103 damaged, while losing only 70 aircraft themselves, a kill ratio of nearly 4-1. When combined with losses to other causes, the German night fighter force lost over 1,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, including many of their most experienced crews who couldn't adapt to being hunted rather than hunters. The human cost was even more devastating. By war's end, 23 of Germany's 30 highest-scoring night fighter aces were dead, most killed in the last 18 months of the war when their radar emissions made them priority targets for Mosquito intruders. The training system collapsed as veteran instructors were recalled to combat units to replace losses, sending novice crews into battle with minimal preparation against an enemy that had turned every German technological advantage into a vulnerability. Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, which had begun 1943 with 120 experienced crews, ended the war with 12 operational aircraft and pilots who averaged less than 10 combat missions. The industrial impact rippled through Germany's war economy as resources poured into developing new radar systems that were obsolete before they reached squadrons. The FUG 244 Bremen, FUG 245 Bremenow, FUG 246 Heidelberg, and FUG 247 Nuremberg were all developed in 1944-45, each designed to operate on different frequencies, use different pulse patterns, or employ frequency hopping techniques to avoid detection. None entered mass production because factories were destroyed, rare materials were unavailable, and the industrial workforce was conscripted or dead. The resources spent on these failed systems, estimated at over 500 million Reichsmarks, could have produced 2,000 additional fighter aircraft or 50,000 anti-aircraft guns. In the aftermath of Germany's surrender, Allied technical intelligence teams interviewed surviving Luftwaffe personnel to understand how completely the night fighter force had been neutralized. Generalmajor Josef Schmid, who had commanded the night fighter forces during their collapse, provided the most damning assessment. By 1944, we were fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything. Every radar we developed was compromised within weeks. Every tactic we employed was countered immediately. Every frequency we used became a channel for our destruction. We had built our entire night defense system on electronic superiority, and when that was turned against us, we had nothing left. The interrogation of Oberst Wolfgang Falk, considered the father of German night fighting, revealed the psychological trauma of watching a magnificent force disintegrate. My pilots went from being hunters to being hunted, from confidence to terror, from believing in their equipment to fearing it. Young men would come to me before missions, begging not to fly with radar, convinced it was a death sentence. I had to threaten courts-martial to get crews to activate their Liechtenstein sets, knowing I was probably sending them to their deaths, but having no alternative if we were to have any hope of stopping the bombers. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from Feldwebel Peter Spaden, one of the few radar operators to survive the entire campaign. We had been told our radar was invisible, undetectable, that the British had no idea we could see them in the darkness. Then suddenly our aircraft started disappearing, shot down by enemies we never saw, guided by equipment we didn't know existed. The scientists kept telling us they had solutions, new frequencies, new systems, but each one lasted weeks before the British countered it. By the end, we were switching off our radar as soon as we detected anything, knowing that using it for more than seconds would bring a Mosquito with cannons blazing. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Japan continued its hopeless struggle against American air power, having learned all the wrong lessons from the German experience. The complete breakdown of German night fighting convinced Japanese commanders that electronic warfare was a trap, that any radar emissions would be exploited by enemies with superior technology. This led to the abandonment of the Type 3Ku Model 6 radar program and the decision to rely entirely on visual night fighting, a choice that condemned Japanese cities to destruction. Captain Yasuna Kazono, who had pioneered Japanese night fighting tactics, wrote in his final report before Japan's surrender, "We studied every German report, analyzed every loss, and concluded that radar was more dangerous than useful against an enemy with superior electronics. So we flew in darkness with our eyes alone, while American bombers with radar bombsights dropped incendiaries with precision that seemed supernatural. We learned from German failure but drew the wrong conclusions. Instead of developing better radar, we developed no radar, and our cities paid the price." The statistics from the final months of the Pacific War reveal the catastrophic consequences of Japan's anti-radar decision. B-29 loss rates dropped from 5.7% in January 1945, when some Japanese fighters still used radar, to 0.9% by July 1945, when all electronic aids had been abandoned. Japanese night fighters claimed only 26 B-29s destroyed in the war's final 4 months, while over 300 B-29 missions systematically incinerated every major Japanese city. The German ghost of Serrate had paralyzed Japanese air defense more effectively than any American countermeasure could have achieved. The Italian experience provided a pathetic footnote to the radar warfare story, demonstrating what happened when a nation lacked both the technology and the industrial base to participate in electronic warfare. The 3 radar-equipped Fiat G-55 fighters completed exactly 7 combat missions before Italy surrendered, detecting no targets, achieving no interceptions, and succeeding only in demonstrating the complete irrelevance of Italian air power in modern warfare. The final mission, flown on April 24, 1945, ended when the radar operator, discovering his equipment had been sabotaged by partisans who poured sugar into the electronics cooling system, threw his headset against the cockpit wall, and declared, "Even our own people know this is useless." The story of how Serrate turned German radar into death beacons represents more than just a tactical victory. It demonstrated a fundamental principle of electronic warfare that would shape military thinking through the Cold War and beyond. Any electronic emission can be detected, tracked, and targeted, turning strength into vulnerability in seconds. The German night fighter force had built its entire doctrine on technological superiority, believing that seeing in the darkness made them invincible, only to discover that their electronic eyes were broadcasting their position to enemies equipped to listen. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1943, before Serrate, German night fighters achieved a kill ratio of nearly 10-1 against our AF bombers. By 1945, they were losing 3 fighters for every bomber they destroyed, their radar emissions serving as homing beacons for Mosquito intruders that struck from darkness with lethal precision. The elaborate ground control system that had cost billions of Reichsmarks and employed hundreds of thousands of personnel had become a liability, its transmissions allowing British intelligence to track every German fighter from takeoff to destruction. The psychological impact extended far beyond the war. Hauptmann Wilhelm Herget, who survived with 73 victories, spent his post-war years haunted by a recurring nightmare where he could hear Mosquito engines approaching but couldn't turn off his radar. The switches frozen, the emissions continuing until cannon shells tore through his aircraft. Other survivors reported similar trauma. The knowledge that their most trusted equipment had betrayed them, creating a paranoia that lasted decades. Post-war analysis by Allied technical intelligence revealed the full scope of German failure to protect their radar systems from exploitation. The FUG 202 Liechtenstein BC operated on fixed frequencies with predictable pulse patterns, making it trivially easy for British receivers to identify and track. The FUG 220SN2, despite operating on different frequencies, used the same basic pulse characteristics, allowing modified Serrate receivers to acquire it within weeks of introduction. The FUG 227 Flensburg, designed to detect British Monica tail warning radar, became useless the moment its existence was revealed by the Woodbridge incident. The entire system neutralized by simply removing Monica from British bombers. Dr. Robert Cockburn, who led British radar countermeasures development, provided a devastating assessment of German electronic warfare capabilities. They built magnificent equipment but never seemed to grasp that we were listening to every transmission, analyzing every pulse, developing countermeasures before their systems reached operational units. They kept believing that changing frequencies would protect them, not understanding that we had broadband receivers that could detect any emission in the electromagnetic spectrum. Every secret weapon they developed was compromised before it saw combat. The German failure wasn't just technical but institutional. The rivalry between Telefunken and other German electronics companies prevented standardization, leading to incompatible systems that couldn't share information. The Luftwaffe's obsession with offensive operations meant defensive electronic warfare received minimal resources until too late. The Nazi regime's persecution of Jewish scientists had driven away many of Germany's best minds in electronics and physics, leaving second-rate engineers to compete against Allied teams that included refugee scientists who understood German technology better than the Germans themselves. The ultimate irony of the Serrate story lies in its simplicity. The British didn't develop revolutionary new technology or employ thousands of scientists to defeat German radar. They simply listened. The AI Mark IV radar sets modified for Serrate were obsolete equipment, replaced in British service by centimetric radar but perfectly suited for detecting German emissions. The modification required disconnecting the transmitter and adding a simple receiver circuit, work that could be completed in squadron workshops without special tools or training. This improvised system, costing perhaps £100 per aircraft, neutralized radar systems that had cost Germany millions of Reichsmarks to develop and deploy. Wing Commander Edward Addison, commanding 100 Group RAF, summarized the German defeat with brutal simplicity. They gave us everything we needed to destroy them. Every pulse from their radar told us where they were, what they were doing, which direction they were facing. It was like fighting an enemy who insisted on shouting his position in a dark room. We just had to listen and shoot. The German crews understood this too late. Oberfeldwebel Hans Rumpelhart, radar operator with Nachtjagdgeschwader 1, survived 17 encounters with Mosquito intruders and described the helplessness of knowing they were betraying themselves. We could hear them sometimes, the Mosquito engines, different from our own, and we knew they were hunting us, following our radar like a bloodhound follows a scent. We would shut down everything, fly in silence, but eventually we had to turn the radar on to search for bombers. And the moment we did, we knew we might be signing our death warrant. When the war ended on May 8, 1945, the German night fighter force that had once seemed invincible had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in forests and abandoned airfields. Of the approximately 3,000 night fighters produced during the war, fewer than 200 remained operational, most grounded for lack of fuel, their sophisticated radar systems useless against an enemy that had turned every electronic emission into a targeting beacon. The human cost was even more devastating. Of the approximately 9,000 aircrew who flew night fighters during the war, over 6,000 were dead, most killed in the final 18 months when Serrate and its successors made every mission a potential death trap. The Kammhuber Line, that elaborate system of radar-controlled boxes that had cost Germany the equivalent of building 10,000 fighter aircraft, lay in ruins, its ground stations bombed, its radars destroyed or captured, its entire concept obsolete in the age of electronic warfare. General Joseph Kammhuber himself, sacked in 1943 for failing to stop our AF bombers, spent the remainder of the war in increasingly irrelevant positions, watching the force he created disappear in flames tracked by their own emissions. The industrial cost was staggering. Germany had invested over 2 billion Reichsmarks in radar development and production during the war, resources that could have produced 50,000 additional fighter aircraft or millions of anti-aircraft shells. The constant need to develop new systems to counter British countermeasures consumed the efforts of thousands of engineers and scientists who might have contributed to other aspects of the war effort. By 1945, Telefunken alone was working on 17 different radar projects, none of which reached production before Germany's surrender, all made irrelevant by British ability to detect and exploit any electronic emission. The story of how Serrate turned German radar into death beacons stands as one of the most complete reversals in military history, a technological advantage that became a fatal vulnerability through elegant enemy adaptation. The German night fighter force had built its entire doctrine on the assumption that seeing in darkness made them invincible predators, only to discover that their electronic vision was broadcasting their position to enemies they never imagined could listen. Every pulse from their Liechtenstein sets, every sweep of their FUG 220 arrays, every emission from their Neptune radars became an invitation for destruction, turning sophisticated technology into what crews bitterly called suicide switches. The numbers provide the final verdict: 257 German night fighters destroyed by Serrate-equipped Mosquitoes, against 70 British losses, a kill ratio that reversed everything Germany had achieved in the early war years. Behind these statistics lay thousands of individual tragedies, experienced crews who had survived years of combat destroyed in seconds by enemies they never saw, guided by the very equipment meant to protect them. The psychological trauma extended beyond individual losses to infect the entire force with paranoia. The knowledge that their most trusted technology had betrayed them, creating a paralysis that accelerated Germany's defeat. The lesson resonated far beyond World War II, establishing a fundamental principle of electronic warfare that remains valid today. Any electronic emission can be detected, classified, and targeted, turning technological advantages into vulnerabilities in the time it takes an enemy to listen and adapt. The German night fighter force learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, their sophisticated radar systems becoming the death beacons that guided British Mosquitoes to destroy them in darkness they once ruled. They had believed technology would make them invisible killers, never understanding until too late that in the electromagnetic spectrum, there is no invisibility, only emissions waiting to be exploited by an enemy clever enough to listen. The last German night fighter victory was claimed on May 4, 1945, when Oberfeldwebel Fritz Staley of Nachtjagdgeschwader 11 shot down a RAF Mosquito near Hamburg, using no radar, guided only by the flames of the burning city below. A return to the primitive visual hunting that had preceded all the sophisticated technology, all the elaborate systems, all the electronic warfare that had promised victory but delivered only death. It was a fitting end to a force that had risen on the promise of seeing in darkness, only to discover that their electronic eyes had become the beacons that marked them for destruction.